Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Perhaps you know that I had previously assigned to me a rather smaller slot, so that what I'm going to talk about has a sort of extra unit stuck on the front. And this is, I now realize, rather simplistic in comparison with some of the talks you've just listened to yesterday. So if you already know this, I hope you'll pardon me, and if you're just getting into it, perhaps you can treat some of it as revision. Now, what makes the picture? Right. Now, this picture you have already seen with Charles Melville. We're now into Persia and beyond, and it is indeed far beyond my capacity to introduce this topic for all cultural forms. So I'm going to concentrate mainly on painting with a little teeny bit of architecture and a little schematic bit of history behind them. And my main purpose is to sort of sweep the path in front of Susan Scully and Leslie Forbes. I'm going to treat this little introduction bit in rather broad strokes without the proper academic nuances, so I hope again you'll pardon that and make the finer points for yourselves. So here we are. This is the map of the Persian Empire at its greatest extent, about 513 BC, under the Achaemenian Darius. Modern Iran, as you doubtless know, forms only a small central part of this, but Persian influence persisted or returned over much of the former empire. So some areas of what we are going to consider as beyond may once have been under Persian rule. But it's quite evident that the Indus formed a very strong barrier. Actually, it's not quite evident because the color doesn't come up very well on this, but the Indus did form a barrier to much Persian invasion. As you also doubtless know, the name Persia, as marked just above the Persian Gulf, derives from the province of Fars. This is a little picture, a tiny detail from the Achaemenian capital of Persepolis. And I put it there just as a sort of hint of what was happening in the old days before the bit we're going to look at. I shall just assert that there is a certain relation to what we see later in things like the restrained elegance of line. I'm not at this moment going to go deeply into whether this is a matter of revival or survival or just a coincidence resulting from the geography and the strong light of the area. Then the other thing I wanted to do was, oh, there's my label, ta-dum. I just wanted to point out where Anatolia is. At the moment in this Persian Empire, it's under Persian rule, but it's going to come, obviously, under modern Turkey eventually. So we're going to start off with a look at the Turkish world, and then we're going to have a tiny little look at North India. Ta-dum, ta-dum. There we go. The Turks, as again you probably know, didn't originate in present-day Turkey, but in Central Asia. In the 11th century, headed by a group known as the Seljuks, they moved into and conquered Iran. The mosque on the left at Aristan was built in the later 11th. And here we're looking up into the vault of the Great Ivan. The material is brick, the form is arcuate, and the embellishments are in stucco. The Seljuks moved westward into Anatolia and established themselves in Konya, and by the early 13th century, they're building away there vigorously. They continue to build even when they get overtaken by Mongol rule in 1243. On the right, we have the Ince Minareli Medrese of Konya, which is of about 1260. we're looking up into the half vault of the main portal. The material is now stone. The form is rounded rather than arcuate, but there are carved embellishments that are in the tradition of Persian work, the important inscription bands and the palmettes of Seljuk Iran, in this version vastly magnified. Not much material survives to make clear the earlier stages of Persian painting, but we can guess at it from decorations on pottery, as on the left. It's a sherd in the Minai technique, which I won't go into, probably of the early 13th century, from Iran, perhaps from the city of Kashan. This style is clearly to be related to that of the manuscript on the right, which is a romance in Persian by the name of Vaka and Golsha. The manuscript contains the name of a painter, and a match to this name is found in Konya. So it's considered probable that the manuscript was produced there in the mid-13th century. Anyway, you'll see the obvious similarity in horses, for example. Now, here we come to a bit of a jump. By the 15th century, the Ottomans, one of the successor groups to the Seljuks, are located in Bursa, in the northwest corner of Anatolia, just opposite the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. On the left, the Mosque of Murad II of 1426 draws on the ceramic tradition of Iran in the form of glazed tiles with applied gold. And it represents the colorful splendor of the 15th century right through from Iran and into Anatolia. Murad's son, Mehmet II, captured Constantinople in 1453, and the city gradually became known as Istanbul. Probably had been a bit before, but we won't go into that. This is the period about which Dr. Skolle is going to talk. So I'm going to pass over this formative period of Ottoman art to have a quick look at what happens afterwards, sort of where it's going to. And I'm doing that on this side in the form of the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent in Istanbul, which was built in 1557. Now, there are tiles in the interior, not quite like the Persian ones, and there is a debt to Byzantine architecture, but I'm not going to enter into either of those. What I wanted to convey here is the feeling of Ottoman Empire, which is what this building gives me. The dominant impression of mature Ottoman architecture is this sense of order and decorum. It's like the Ottoman polity. It's formed of diverse elements, but they're held in check and molded into an empire. And the whole thing is extremely complex, but it has a sort of logical serenity to it. Here, just a year later, 1558, is an Ottoman manuscript, the Süleyman Name, which is history, and again it shows the particular interest in the empire. It's showing you how it was run, it's showing you current history. Its pages convey the same dignified order. Here we look into Topkapi Palace. The functions of various people can be deduced, and the roof has been lifted off the divan. Let's see if I can get that here. So that we see into it and we can see the innermost workings of the state. The general conception of the picture is Persian in origin. The scene is laid out with its high viewpoint, and it has a certain diagrammatic character and carefully placed colors. There is even a memory of Persian landscape conventions in the sparse grass tufts. There is, though, a trace of Europe in the treatment of the trees and some arbitrary shadow. But wholesale European influence is, as it were, held at arm's length. I think this is because the Ottoman state is a frontline state in regard to Europe. It'll take a bit, but it has to be careful. So anyway, the whole picture is in Ottoman dress. Now we'll go to India. The Turkish forces who invaded India in 1192 discovered a vigorous tradition of architecture and of sculpture, Hindu and Jain. The Qawwat al-Islam Mosque at Delhi was first constructed from the spoils of numerous Hindu and Jain temples. I think the number is estimated at 27, but the precise number doesn't matter. The columns and beams of this Trabeat architecture have been richly adorned. And in spite of being in a mosque, you may notice that there is some survival of figural representations here. Lady. Goddess, presumably. So these sort of seem to have got by with only being slightly defaced. In 1198, a screen of arches was added. That's the bit over here. To give it a more Islamic appearance. The visual impression is from the Persian tradition, though the construction is of stone, and the arches are formed not with radiating voussoirs, but are corbelled out, as is clearly shown by the horizontal lines of colour variation. Now, for 3.5 centuries, there is a tract of history that can loosely be called the Sultanate period. During this, a great variety of buildings and manuscripts were produced, some close to Persian prototypes, and some more divergent from them. A rather Persianate cluster of manuscripts was produced in Mandu in western central India in the late 15th to early 16th century. One such manuscript is the Nimatname on the right, a book of recipes and other practical advice, such as how many musicians you need to take if you're going on a hunting trip. So the Nimatname was started by one ruler by the name of Ghiyasuddin Khalji, who had retired with a view to being served entirely by women, and it's completed for his son Nasruddin after 1500. The Persian tradition is evident in the general lines of the style, but we have some different features in the architecture and a sort of different look about it. So you wouldn't mistake it for Persian, is what I'm trying to say. We are in a close match for the pool on the other side, which is in a little pleasure pavilion, also produced for Nasruddin in 1508. So you can see how the architecture matches what's shown in the picture. And in many Sultanate manuscripts, one argues that they are from India on the grounds of the architecture. Though the Mughals first entered India in 1526, evidence of their patronage is mainly known from the 15th century, the mid-century onwards. When Humayun, the second Mughal ruler, acquired the services of several artists from Iran. The picture on the left shows Mir Musawwir, one such artist, and is either by the subject himself or by his son. It is in classical Safavid style, elegant and informative in an abstract kind of way. The drawing of the reader on the right represents the transformation that took place in Mughal India during the following quarter century. Unfortunately, it's not dated, so one can't be frightfully sharp about that. The drawing is attributable to Basawan, one of the numerous Hindu painters to serve the Mughals. While it has elements in common with the Persian picture, in conception, flowing line, costume, it has new effects of volume and some more down-to-earth detail. I particularly like the toes, if you look at those. I think this change is because the Hindu painters, with their strong background of three-dimensional sculpture are able to take up ideas that come flowing in from Europe more easily. And again, unlike the Ottomans, they don't need to feel resistant to European things because they're at a safe distance from them. Here we are in the time of Akbar in 1595, a picture for him in a Nizami on the left. Mughal painting, of course, continues afterwards, as Leslie Forbes is going to explain to you. What's happening here is that an old woman castigates Sultan Sanjar for the oppression she's experiencing. The influence of Europe is very clear in the treatment. We have realism, volume, the suggestion of shadow, and a magnificent effect of recession. But this manuscript was produced during a phase of renewed interest in Persian literature on the part of the patron. The Mughal picture makes an interesting comparison with this on the right, which is basically the same story but applied to a different sultan, Malik Shah. The text of this manuscript, which is one of the works of Haji Kamani, was copied in Baghdad in 1396, and the pictures are probably of about 1390. And it's got a curious similarity to the Mughal picture in that the lady is waving her arms and has a long trailer down the back, whereas in many other pictures she's a little bent old lady. So something I'd like to look into further. So anyway, this is my introduction. I hope it's of some use. Now we come to the particular matter of Nizami and Amir Khosrow. In the late 12th century, the celebrated Persian poet Nizami composed his Khamsa, a quintet of books. The first book contains a set of didactic essays reinforced with brief parables, and the other 4 books are romances, 3 of which have a quasi-historical background. At the turn of the 13th to 14th century, Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, Amir Khosrow of Delhi, who was born in India and lived there, though he is of Central Asian Turkish extraction and Persian culture, so that he's really a sort of paradigm of Persia and beyond, he composed a Khamsa of his own that in some respects follows that of Nizami and in some departs from it. The works of both poets have been illustrated both in Iran and India, and in consequence we have a great wealth of illustrations. In order to treat this subject within reasonable limits, I intend to use the State Library of Victoria's Amir Khosrow as a central focus. The Amir Khosrow is going to come up mostly on the left side of the screen, and it's going to be unlabeled. The comparisons are mostly on the right and labeled. The manuscript, the Amir Khosrow, as you may see in the exhibition, is dated to 1599 or 1600. Here, I'm comparing it with a much earlier picture, which is from a Nizami. The basic iconography of this stays very much the same. Some illustrations, though from different times and places, have the same iconography in pictures for both poets, and this is especially evident in the illustrations that give a framework to the tale of the Sasanian prince Bahram Gur, which Nizami calls Hafpekar, 7 fair forms, and Amir Khosrow calls Hashbehisht, 8 paradises. Amir Khosrow is sort of notionally paying tribute to Nizami, but he's always trying to sneak in something that he's a little sort of more so. We have Bahram Gur goes and visits a pavilion of a princess every day in the week. It's rather interestingly the same sort of structure as we have with those jinns that Dr. Carboni was talking about yesterday, a jinn for each color. but I noticed that the color sequence wasn't quite the same as it is in these. But, it all hangs together in a conception of cosmology, what the world is made of. Here we have the Black Pavilion of Saturday. The Amir Khosrow Pavilion, oh, I'm sorry, I should tell you what date. No, I shouldn't. The Amir Khosrow Pavilion on the left has a similar iconography to that on the right, which illustrates a Nizami text of 1411. Those who are deeply into this subject will know that it's not a complete Nizami, it's part of an anthology, but for present purposes, it's a Nizami text. What the pictures do not reveal is that Amir Khosrow embellishes the title of the pavilion. For him, it is not simply the Black Pavilion, but the Musk Black Pavilion. And in it, the princess will tell a story that is a bit different from that in the Nizami. There we have the black one. Some manuscripts confine themselves to the illustration of the first two pavilions, just the black and the pavilion that for Nizami is yellow and for Amir Khosrow is saffron. Some manuscripts of either poet show the pavilions of all the days of the week, and as you imagine, when all pavilions are shown, there is a risk of repetitive dullness. But the illustrator of the Melbourne Amir Khosrow triumphantly takes us through 7 days of the week with a delightfully varied architecture. Where the Nizami pavilion would be green, Amir Khosrow's is verdant. Where Nizami's would be red, Amir Khosrow's is pomegranate-colored, the designation perhaps emphasized by a pomegranate tree growing beside it. Where Nizami's pavilion is blue, Amir Khosrow's is violet. And here the painter introduces variety by rendering the pavilion as a delicate gazebo. And to return for a moment to the narrative, it will be no accident that Amir Khosrow accords the more romantic stories of his collection to the pomegranate and the violet pavilions, the fruit and the flower. For once, Amir Khosrow follows Nizami in naming the Thursday pavilion Sandalwood. Presumably, he could not think of an additional poetic way of saying brown. The pavilion of Friday, the holy day, is white for Nizami and camphor white for Amir Khosrow. The camphor pavilion in the Melbourne manuscript is of particular interest since it's unfinished. The story told in it concerns the conduct that distinguishes a chaste and pious wife. It is, however, interesting that the Melbourne illustration was intended to portray a slightly greater degree of intimacy between Bahram and the princess than is shown in the other pavilions. And we may perhaps wonder whether this is the reason it's not completed. The other thing it shows, of course, only I don't know if you can see it frightfully well on the screen, but that sort of little unit of arabesque sticking up above the picture must be a later addition because it runs over a white dome. We now, back. Yeah. We now move to the story, from the story of Bahram Gur to that of another Sasanian prince named, like the author, Khosrow. So Amir Khosrow on this side for once. This prince has journeyed to Armenia, met and fallen in love with the princess Shireen, and is entertained by her aunt. In this illustration, it is by no means clear to me whether the lady in conversation with the prince is intended as Shireen or as her aunt. Indeed, the whole picture could be taken for one of Bahram Gur's pavilions, were it a little more definite in color. This demonstrates the fact that some pictures have a generic iconography that could well be used in other manuscripts for other subjects, both from the Amir Khosrow. Similarly, in the following scenes from the Amir Khosrow, we have a very charming effect, but the pictures, the compositions, the precise compositions could have been used the other way round. And indeed, it seems to me not impossible that the artist got them the wrong way round. In the left-hand one, Khosrow and Shireen are enthroned at night and entertained by 10 youths and 10 maidens. Khosrow invites the attendants to pair off with the promise that he will unite them. However, Shireen and Khosrow themselves quarrel and fail to follow suit. In the second fête champêtre, on the right, Khosrow has journeyed to Isfahan to find solace with the beautiful Shahar, who is a rather shady lady, though technically chaste. She welcomes him and entertains him with music, and in the morning they marry. This moment comes a little later in the story. Shireen has heard of the marriage. A young sculptor come civil engineer named Farhad has fallen in love with her. Khosrow has caused the death of Farhad. Here, Khosrow has come to the door of Shireen's castle to plead with him for admittance. And the same composition with the same storyline we find in Nizami, I think, does the label? Yes, thank you, in the exhibition. Now, this is, I think, an extraordinarily important composition type, and I would like to sort of go into it for a moment. I see it as a sort of L-shaped, vertical on the left, of course, and horizontal coming towards us. I think it is a sort of paradigm of Persian painting in that it tells you what is going on, but it is not realistic, naturalistic. I mean, if you imagine it in cinematographic terms, you couldn't do a shot which would show the gentleman at the bottom of the castle and the lady at the top of it without panning. So space is reduced. And again, they couldn't really hold a very long and discursive conversation from that sort of distance, but it's telling you what happens. So this character in Persian painting is what I mean by diagrammatic. It's like a chart. It shows you, you know what the narrative is. Everything's perfectly plain. And on top of that, it has a certain sort of symbolism, because obviously Shireen at the top of the window has the upper hand in psychological terms, and furthermore in symbolic terms relating to mysticism, it places her more suitably as the divine object, with the lover below asking to come in and come up. So it's a very important composition, and had been used in other works from the 14th century onwards, and it gets used in many, many different sorts of narratives and places. Another point where the Amir Khosrow and the Nizami stories are quite close, though not identical, occurs in their third book, which is set in pre-Islamic Arabia, as we were hearing yesterday. Majnun's mad for love of Layla, a girl from a different tribe in Amir Khosrow. When Majnun is wandering in the desert, he is befriended by Nofal, a Bedouin chieftain. Nofal offers to obtain Layla as Majnun's bride, and a tribal battle ensues. For the work of both authors, the scene is distinguished from a generic scene of warfare by the presence of camels. In the Nizami, this side from the 1411 text, Majnun is watching, and he's going to intervene in the battle. In the Amir Khosrow story, Majnun is not yet present at the initial battle, which is what we've got in the Amir Khosrow side. Later, he comes to hear of a plot to kill Layla, so he goes and clutches at Nofal's stirrup to prevent further warfare. Then there's the matter of visits to Majnun in the desert. Amir Khosrow also diverges from Nizami in the matter of visitors to Majnun, when he is in the desert pining for Layla. In Nizami, Majnun is visited by his father and then by his uncle and mother. In Amir Khosrow, he is also visited by his father, but later by friends who seek him out and invite him to join their joyful gathering. This subject gives rise to very endearing scenes of affection, both in the Melbourne manuscript, in a fairly simple but sweet effect, and in a manuscript of 1495 in Herat style, in which we may possibly see the hand of the celebrated painter Behzad. One story starts off somewhat similar and then diverges, as Dr. Abdullayev has shown in the exhibition book. We have the slave girl whom Bahramgur takes out with him in a hunt. She's named Fitne in Nizami and Delaram, Heartsease, in Amir Khosrow. The girl raises Bahram's ire and he casts her off. By long practice, Fitne, the Nizami one, acquires the capability to carry a calf up a flight of stairs, and so, as one does, and so confounds Bahram and is reunited with him. Delaram, on the other hand, learns from a wise man how to draw wild animals into an enchanted sleep, and thus she achieves the same result. And I think that's clearly Amir Khosrow trying to upstage Nizami. Now, the parables in the first book of the quintets are quite different in both. So here is a sequence of the Amir Khosrow ones. These pictures run fairly true to a tradition of Amir Khosrow pictures. The picture on the left, and indeed on the right, shows us a group of travelers in the desert who are stricken with thirst. A man comes along and offers them water, but since each refuses to drink and passes the water to his friend, they all die of thirst. The Melbourne manuscript has several figures, and colors which relate it to a version probably of the 1520s in the style of Bokhara. I won't elaborate, I hope you can see them. We now come to the Mughal effect. The Amir Khosrow manuscript on the right was copied in Mughal India in 1598 and can be considered as a companion volume to the Nizami of 1595, of which I showed you a picture before. In this parable in the first book, a young man wanders in a garden and an old man makes an approach to him. The young man taunts the old man for his stooped posture. The old man replies that he's looking on the ground for the coin of lost youth, and that one day this will be the lot of the other. In the Melbourne picture, the young man and the old are shown separated symbolically by a tree. In the Mughal painting, we have a great deal of luscious detail and background added, but the essentials are the same. The figures are separated by a tree. Youth still wears his vermilion garment, and the old man still wears a blue gown, though he has taken off his yellow coat. Sometimes both Persian and Mughal comparisons can be brought to bear. This subject provides us with an interesting example of a rather stable iconography. Another of the parables, this parable deals with the longing of the soul for the divine. A furnace stoker looks at a king and loves him and weeps. The king understands and smiles. The smoky heat of the furnace is to be identified with the mystical passion experienced by the stoker. The iconography of the Melbourne picture is quite close to that of an illustration probably from the Caucasus that precedes it by some 100 years. But then its fundamental elements are also to be found in the Mughal manuscript of 1598, its near contemporary. At first, we see a confusing mass of figures, but if we take out a detail that eliminates some 2/3 of the picture, a similarity to the Melbourne picture becomes clear, albeit with much augmented landscape. We return to the story of Khosrow and Shireen. Farhad, you will recall, has fallen in love with Shireen. Shireen asks Farhad to build a channel that will bring to her the milk from the flocks in the mountains, and she comes to visit him at work. The Melbourne picture is unusual in showing Farhad hugging his knees, but I'd like you to note this point. The Mughal composition shows the more usual iconography, as it might be found in a Nizami. In spite of this difference, the Melbourne and the Mughal manuscript have in common Shireen and a horse and a rocky background, as might be expected. But looking more closely, it becomes clear that there's an odder similarity. Shireen's rather distinctive costume in the Persian manuscript, orange and blue with a draped headdress, has been transferred to one of the attendants in the Mughal picture. How this comes about actually is a mystery to me. I mean, there's obviously a back tradition, but I can't quite see what it is. Yes, there we are. Now, in Nizami, Khosrow becomes jealous of this slight connection between Farhad and Shireen, and he sends a messenger who gives Farhad false news of the death of Shireen, which caused Farhad to die. In Amir Khosrow, this is slightly elaborated because, first of all, Khosrow goes himself disguised as a shepherd. So on the far side, we have Khosrow himself visiting Farhad, disguised as a shepherd, but it's using the format which in a Nizami would be the messenger. On this side, in the Mughal manuscript, we have the messenger bringing the false news. He's finding Farhad in conversation with a shepherd. But the remarkable thing in the present context is that we see here Farhad in a hunched position, which matches that we had in this. So there's some sort of cross current. I don't quite know what it is, but something has connected there. A final point I should like to make touches both on similarity and divergence, and on the legacy of Persian painting in India. We're both Nizami here. In Nizami's work, at a climactic moment in the narrative, Majnun is led by a well-wisher to the encampment where Layla is, or possibly to the town where she is, and both the lovers faint from emotion. The well-wisher tries to revive them. This subject has a long history, as you can see from at least the 1411 upwards, and I'm not sure if it's before that, but anyway, it's long. Though the Mughal, of course, treats it in a slightly different manner. Now, this episode doesn't occur in Amir Khosrow, but instead we have Layla deciding to visit Majnun, not Majnun going to Layla. Layla goes to Majnun. She equips herself with a camel and a mahmal, the litter on top of a camel, and she goes and finds Majnun. She finds him asleep and takes his head on her lap. On waking, Majnun faints and stays thus for a while, and then they both revive and talk to each other of love. In the Mughal Amir Khosrow, we don't unfortunately have a camel, which can be quite a key piece, but we have the conversation in the desert. But in later Mughal pictures, there are quite a number of later pictures in various Mughal albums and on show in the exhibition. And Mughal pictures, so far as I know, show the couple in conversation and with a camel, and if they do, they are in the tradition of Amir Khosrow and not in that of Nizami. Camel again, I mean, it's got an extra man leading it who's extraneous, I think, but it's the basic fact. And so we see that there's a web of traditions of illustrations that meet and diverge between the two Khamsas. How the traditions are handed down or transferred from center to center is most often not certain. For the most part, we do not know if ways of portraying things were carried in complete manuscripts, in isolated sketches, or in the memory of painters.